The last sound I ever heard in my old life was the pneumatic lift groaning like a dying animal. I'd been working underneath a Silverado that wasn't even mine, a customer's truck with a blown gasket, when the hydraulic seal I'd been begging my boss to replace for 6 months finally gave out. 4,000 pounds of American steel came down like the world's least fair judgment, and the last thing I thought, with perfect, stupid clarity, was I never even got to finish the audiobook. 24 years old, that was the whole obituary. 24 years of double shifts at Denny's Auto Body, of covering my father's debts to men who didn't send invoices, of learning exactly how far a paycheck could stretch if you were creative enough with instant noodles and gas station coffee. My mother left when I was 6 months old, and honestly, by the time I was 16, I understood her decision on a spiritual level. My dad wasn't a bad man so much as he was a slot machine wearing a human face. Every dollar that touched his hand went somewhere it shouldn't, and every few months I'd come home to find some guy with a neck tattoo standing in our kitchen, reminding him about payment plans. I died broke, exhausted, and completely alone under a truck that wasn't even a nice one. The last text message on my phone had been from my father, sent 4 hours earlier. "Need a favor, call me when you get a sec." I never called him back. In a strange way, that felt like the most honest ending my old life could have offered, cut off mid-sentence, mid-debt, mid-obligation, the way it had always been. My one escape, the single soft thing I kept for myself in 24 years of hard edges, was a novel. Not a good one, by any objective literary standard, a sprawling, melodramatic, occasionally poorly edited web serial called The Ashford Legacy, which I read obsessively on a phone with a screen so cracked I'd memorized which corner to avoid tapping. It followed Grant Ashford, real estate heir and campus golden boy, as he slowly fell for a scrappy scholarship engineer named Sophie Bennett, fighting off his cold, jealous rival every step of the way. I'd read it front to back more times than I could count, usually at 2 in the morning, hiding under a threadbare blanket so the sound of my father's shouting matches wouldn't reach me. It was predictable, it was trashy. It was, for 400 chapters, the only place in my life where things reliably worked out, and, if I'm being completely honest, the only place I ever let myself do absolutely nothing on purpose, guilt-free, for hours at a time. I was, it turns out, an extremely gifted procrastinator when the alternative was doing anything my father asked me to do. So when I opened my eyes again to sunlight, actual warm, golden sunlight pouring through a floor-to-ceiling window, my first thought wasn't heaven. My first thought was, since when does heaven have a Peloton in the corner? I sat up. The sheets were the kind of soft that shouldn't legally be allowed, 600 thread count at minimum, and they smelled like cedar and money. The room around me looked like a boutique hotel had a baby with an Architectural Digest spread, exposed brick, a wall of vinyl records, a closet through the open door that was bigger than my entire childhood apartment. I stumbled to the mirror over the dresser, and the man staring back at me was not the hollow-eyed grease monkey I'd been an hour, or a lifetime, ago. He was maybe 21, with dark auburn hair that fell in a deliberately careless part, storm gray eyes, and the kind of jaw structure that got people modeling contracts instead of court summons. I looked, against every possible odds, expensive. It took me exactly 11 minutes of frantic Googling on the phone conveniently sitting on the nightstand, a phone that recognized my face on the first try, which was its own small horror. To understand what had happened, I knew this room. I knew this face. I knew this whole miserable, gorgeous, backstabbing world, because it was the exact world of my favorite novel, down to the skyline and the campus name stamped on the syllabus open on the desk. I had transmigrated directly into the pages of my favorite guilty pleasure novel. There was, as there always is, a catch. I hadn't become Grant Ashford. I had become Julian Cross, heir to the Cross real estate dynasty, the Ashfords' oldest rivals, and, more specifically, the novel's second lead. The villain. The guy who spends 400 chapters trying to sabotage the actual romance, gets increasingly unhinged about it, and by the final arc gets systematically and humiliatingly dismantled by Grant Ashford's legal team, losing his fortune, his name, and, in one particularly brutal chapter, his father's respect, such as it was. I sat on the edge of a bed that cost more than my old apartment building, and I laughed. Not a healthy laugh. The kind of laugh you laugh right before you either cry or start planning something. Absolutely not, I told my very handsome reflection. You want me to throw away this? I gestured at the walk-in closet, the skyline view, the bank app that had, no exaggeration, more zeros in it than my old phone number, over a rivalry with a guy I've never even talked to. Buddy, I have died once already for less money than what's in this checking account. I am not doing that twice. The plan formed fast, ugly, and completely without dignity. I was not going to be the villain. I was going to become Grant Ashford's best friend, his biggest fan, his most devoted hype man, so thoroughly and aggressively likable that by the time the actual romance plot kicked in, he'd see me as a golden retriever instead of a threat. I would keep my money, I would keep my skin, and somewhere down the line, I would even help him get the girl, because a happily married off Grant Ashford was a Grant Ashford who had absolutely no reason to ruin me. It was, I thought, a genuinely brilliant plan. It also required almost no actual physical exertion beyond being charming, which suited me fine, because if there was one thing 24 years of hard labor had taught me, it was how to spot the lowest effort route to survival and take it without an ounce of shame. I had no idea, sitting there in my stolen mansion of a dorm suite, that I was about to become the worst matchmaker in the recorded history of Fairview University, and that the first person I'd ever fall in love with was going to be the exact man I was trying to save myself from. Enjoying the disaster so far? This is only the beginning. Julian's about to make several more spectacularly bad decisions in the name of self-preservation, and none of them are going to work out the way he plans. Follow the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. Fairview University sat on the edge of the Charles River, all Gothic stone and old money, the kind of campus where the coffee shops had doormen and half the parking lot was foreign sports cars. I spent my first 3 days there doing what any reasonable person recovering from sudden death and reincarnation would do. I ordered obscene amounts of room service, bought a jacket that cost more than my dad's truck, napped through 2 guest lectures I was technically enrolled in, and avoided anyone who looked like they might recognize Julian Cross on sight. I told myself I'd unpack my suitcase eventually, the same way I used to tell myself I'd start jogging eventually, which is to say, never, and with total peace about it. There was something almost obscene about how easy it was to disappear into that first stretch of luxury. In my old life, 3 unstructured days would have meant 3 days of missed shifts, angry texts from my manager, maybe a call from one of my father's associates asking where he'd gotten to. Here, nobody called. Nobody needed anything from me at all, and it took me an embarrassingly long time to understand that the silence wasn't a trap. It was just what having money actually felt like. I spent one entire afternoon doing nothing but lying in that absurdly soft bed, scrolling a class schedule I had no intention of taking seriously, and feeling, for the first time in 24 years, gloriously and legally unproductive. That plan lasted until Thursday morning, when I was sprinting late to my first class, balancing an iced coffee, a muffin, and a backpack I hadn't finished unpacking, and collided directly into 6 feet and 2 inches of a man built like an Ivy League linebacker. The coffee went first, then the muffin. Both landed, with tragic precision, directly down the front of a very expensive charcoal sweater. "Oh my God," I said, on instinct, grabbing a fistful of napkins from my bag like that was going to help. "I am so sorry. Are you hurt? Do you need? Here, let me." I looked up mid-apology to hand him a napkin, and every word in my brain evaporated at once. Oh no, I knew this face. I had read 400 chapters describing this face. Black hair, a jaw that looked carved rather than grown, eyes so dark they read as obsidian even in direct sunlight. It was Grant Ashford, first in line for a real estate empire, with buildings from Back Bay to Chicago's Gold Coast, campus legend, and the single most photographed 20-year-old on the entire eastern seaboard. He looked down at the coffee stain spreading across his chest, then up at me, with an expression of pure, icy disbelief, like I had personally violated several federal statutes. "You," he said. Just that, like my name was a diagnosis. "Me," I agreed, way too enthusiastically, still holding out the useless napkin. "In my defense, I didn't mean to assault your sweater. That was more of an accident. A crime of passion, if you will, except the passion was caffeine." His jaw ticked. Somewhere behind him, a small crowd of students had already stopped to watch, phones half raised, because apparently Cross versus Ashford collisions were spectator sports here. "Do you have any idea," he said, low and clipped, "how many times you've done something like this on purpose, cutting me off in the parking garage, accidentally scheduling your gym time over mine?" and now this. I blinked. The original Julian Cross had, apparently, spent the better part of the last year engineering elaborate, petty warfare against this man, all in service of a jealousy over grades and a girl who hadn't even transferred to the school yet. None of that was on my agenda anymore, but Grant clearly hadn't gotten the company memo. "Okay, hear me out," I said, setting the ruined muffin down on a nearby ledge with the solemnity of a funeral. New Julian. Rebranded. I'm going to buy you a new sweater. I'm going to buy you a coffee to replace the one currently soaking into your abs, and then I am never going to speak of this again, unless you want to speak of it, in which case I will speak of it constantly, because I clearly have main character energy trapped in a supporting role. Something flickered across his face. Not warmth, nothing that generous, not yet, but the smallest crack in the ice, like he genuinely could not tell if I was insane or just extremely caffeinated. You're being weird, Cross. I contain multitudes, I said, and before he could respond, I peeled $200 out of my wallet. Julian Cross's wallet, technically, but we were sharing a body now, and pressed it into his hand. Sweeter fund, buy something nice. Maybe something that doesn't make it so easy to see your abs through wet fabric, actually. On second thought, keep the sweater exactly like this. I turned and walked away before he could recover enough to respond, my heart absolutely hammering, half from the sheer terror of having improvised in front of Fairview University's Crown Prince, and half from something else entirely. Something warm and unfamiliar that I chose, very firmly, to ignore. Behind me, I heard Marcus Doyle, my new roommate, jog up beside me with the wide-eyed look of a man who'd just watched a car crash in slow motion. "Dude," Marcus said. "You just handed Grant Ashford cash. I panicked. You flirted. I panicked flirtatiously. There's a difference." Marcus did not look convinced. Frankly, neither was I. I want to be clear that the emotional turning point of my new life did not happen the way I expected, or the way it happens in every trashy novel I've ever read, with a slow-burn dinner or a rain-soaked confession. It happened 3 days later, in a hallway outside a boardroom, over a panic attack nobody else in the building even noticed was happening. I'd been summoned, there's no gentler word for it, to a Cross-Ashford business mixer, one of those excruciating events where old money families performed civility at each other over shrimp cocktail. I was cornering a table of shrimp with genuine dedication when I spotted Grant near the elevator bank. Alone, one hand braced flat against the wall. Something about the way he stood was wrong. His shoulders were too rigid. His breathing, when I got close enough to hear it, was too fast, too shallow, the kind of breathing I recognized instantly, because I'd watched my own father hyperventilate through debt collector visits often enough to know the shape of it. His hands, when I looked down, had the faintest, betraying tremor, the kind that a room full of people who'd spent their whole lives performing composure would absolutely notice and never forgive. I set down my plate of shrimp, a genuine sacrifice, given how hard I'd worked for it, and crossed the room without really deciding to, the way you cross a room toward a fire alarm before you've consciously registered the sound. "Hey," I said quietly, no audience, no performance in my voice at all. "Hey, look at me. I'm fine," Grant said, which was the least convincing sentence I had ever heard a human being produce. "You are extremely not fine, and that's okay. But you're also about 90 seconds from passing out in front of 40 people who each own at least one yacht, so let's not do that here." I steered him gently by the elbow through a side door into an empty stairwell before he could argue, and once the heavy door clicked shut behind us, blocking out the string quartet and the small talk, something in him seemed to buckle. "My father is in there," Grant said, staring at a point somewhere past my shoulder, his voice stripped completely of its usual ice, telling the Whitfields I'm ready to run the Western Division. I'm 22. I haven't slept in 4 days. I don't know what ready even means anymore. I just know that if I walk back in there and my hands are shaking, it's over. Everyone will see it. Everyone always sees it. I didn't know this Grant Ashford. The novel had painted him as untouchable, cold, controlled, effortlessly perfect. Nobody had written this part. A 22-year-old kid, raised by a company instead of a family, terrified of his own hands shaking in front of investors. "Okay," I said, and sat down, right there on the cold concrete stairwell steps, in a suit that cost more than my dad's car. "Sit, Julian. Sit down, Ashford. I will physically pull you down by that very expensive tie if I have to, and we both know I'm unhinged enough to actually do it." He sat. I talked him through it the only way I knew how. The same trick I used to use on myself, in the back of the shop, before I had to walk out and tell a customer their car needed $4,000 of work they couldn't afford. 4 counts in, hold, 4 counts out. Over and over, until his shoulders dropped half an inch, until his hands stopped their fine, betraying tremor. "Nobody's ever seen me like this," he said finally, quiet, almost accusing, like it was my fault for witnessing it. "Good thing I don't share," I said. "It'll cost you, though, a flicker of something almost like amusement." "Cost me what?" "Lunch. Tomorrow. You're buying, since I bought you a sweater, and, apparently, 4 minutes of a normal human breakdown." He looked at me for a long moment, dark eyes doing something searching and unreadable, and for the first time since I'd woken up in this ridiculous new life, I felt the ground under Julian Cross's careful, self-preserving plan tilt just slightly sideways. "Fine," Grant said. "Lunch. Neither of us mentioned it wasn't a business meeting. Neither of us needed to. Here's the problem with accidentally becoming someone's emotional safe place. It makes it very inconvenient to also be executing phase 2 of your self-preservation plan, which was, if you'll recall, find Grant Ashford a girlfriend so he stops being a threat to my continued existence. I decided the safest move was to lean in harder, because feelings were expensive and I had already died once from being financially irresponsible. I am, by nature, a deeply lazy person who happened to fall into an extremely high-effort hobby, and matchmaking a billionaire real estate heir turned out to require a truly inconvenient amount of scheming for someone whose favorite pastime used to be doing absolutely nothing. Enter Sophie Bennett, scholarship transfer, mechanical engineering major, captain of Fairview's Formula SAE racing team, and, according to 400 chapters of a novel I'd read under a blanket, the actual female lead destined to steal Grant Ashford's heart. She had a buzz-cut fade on one side, grease permanently under her fingernails despite her best efforts, and absolutely no patience for old money nonsense, which made her instantly the most likable person on this entire campus. "So," I said, sliding into the seat across from her in the campus garage, a converted mechanical bay where her team built race cars, of all the beautifully ironic places for a former auto mechanic's soul to end up. "Hypothetically, what do you think of Grant Ashford?" Sophie didn't even look up from the carburetor she was elbow-deep in. "The rich icicle? He's fine. Why?" "No reason," I said, which is the international sign language for extremely large reason. "I just think you two would have incredible chemistry. Opposites. Warmth meets ice. Grease meets champagne. It practically writes itself." Sophie finally looked up, wiping her hands on a rag, studying me with the kind of clinical suspicion I imagined she usually reserved for engines that made unexplained noises. "Julian, are you setting me up?" "I am facilitating," I said with as much dignity as I could summon. "There's a difference." There was not, in fact, a difference, and Sophie clearly knew it, but, bless her competitive heart, she also happened to be 3 weeks from the regional SAE finals and needed a second pair of hands who actually knew a torque wrench from a lug nut, which, thanks to 24 years of unpaid family labor, I absolutely did. "Tell you what," she said. "Help me get this transmission rebuilt by Friday, and I'll let you drag your icicle down here for a tour." I should mention, for context, that I had not touched a torque wrench since the day the hydraulic lift ended my old life, and some small superstitious part of me had half expected the muscle memory to have died with the rest of me. It hadn't. The second my hands closed around cold steel, 24 years of Saturday mornings spent flat on my back under other people's cars came flooding back so completely that for a moment I forgot I was supposed to be a rich, idle heir at all. The transmission rebuild turned out to be the first genuinely good thing that had happened to me since I'd died. There was something almost meditative about it, hands deep in an engine, the specific, satisfying click of a bolt seating correctly, the way 24 years of muscle memory came flooding back the second I picked up a torque wrench, even in a body that had never once turned one before. For the first time since waking up rich, I wasn't performing. I was just working, and it felt like exhaling after holding my breath for a week, which was, I realized, a strange thing to admit about a man who otherwise avoided anything resembling effort with near-religious dedication. I was lazy about the things I didn't love. I had simply never been given anything to love before. Sophie noticed. "You're actually good at this," she said, watching me reset a clutch plate with the kind of ease that clearly didn't match a real estate heir's resume. Like, suspiciously good. Where'd a cross learn to rebuild a transmission? Misspent youth, I said, which was, in its own roundabout way, entirely true. That was how, for the next 2 weeks, I ended up spending most of my afternoons back under a car. This time by choice, this time getting paid in nothing but the sheer, uncomplicated joy of doing something I was actually good at, while formulating increasingly elaborate schemes to get Grant Ashford and Sophie Bennett into the same room long enough for sparks to fly. None of the schemes worked the way I planned. The first attempt was a surprise campus tour of the engineering garage, timed for when Grant would be walking back from lecture. Grant showed up right on schedule and spent the entire 40 minutes watching me explain torque specs to Sophie with an expression I could only describe as murderous. The second attempt was a 3-person dinner, arranged so they could get to know each other. Grant answered every one of Sophie's questions in aggressively short sentences, then spent the rest of the meal aggressively refilling my water glass every time it dipped below half full, ignoring Sophie's completely valid, empty glass entirely. "You are the single worst wingman I have ever witnessed," Sophie told me afterward, not unkindly, packing up her tools with the weary patience of someone watching a slow-motion disaster. "You do realize he spent the entire dinner looking at you, right?" "He was probably calculating my net worth," I said. "It's a rivalry thing, old habit." Sophie gave me a long, flat look that I would come to recognize over the following weeks as her signature expression whenever I was being deliberately, catastrophically dense. "Sure, Julian," she said, "a rivalry thing. I did not take the hint." I have never, historically, been good at taking hints. It's part of why I ended up crushed under a truck instead of, say, going back to community college like my guidance counselor had suggested. So I doubled down instead, escalating into a third and considerably more expensive attempt. The campus charity gala, which I'd convinced myself was foolproof. Candlelight, string quartet, a silent auction, the exact kind of setting that novels like mine practically demanded for a romantic spark. I spent an unreasonable amount of money bidding Sophie and Grant into the same dinner table, seated them directly across from each other, and then sat back to watch true love blossom. Instead, Grant spent the entire first course interrogating Sophie, with terrifying corporate precision, about exactly how much time she and I spent together in the garage, what we talked about, and whether elbow deep in an engine block was, in his words, a euphemism I should be aware of. Sophie answered every single question with the barely restrained glee of a woman who had figured out something I clearly hadn't, feeding him increasingly detailed and entirely true descriptions of grease stains and torque specs just to watch his jaw get tighter. "You are actively sabotaging my plan," I hissed at her under the table, once Grant had excused himself to take a call that I was fairly sure did not exist. "Your plan is bad, Julian," Sophie said serenely, sipping her water. "I'm doing you a favor by letting it fail spectacularly instead of slowly." By the time dessert arrived, Grant had returned to the table, sat down beside me instead of across from Sophie, and spent the rest of the night with his knee pressed firmly against mine under the tablecloth, saying almost nothing, radiating a silent, simmering possessiveness that I chose, bravely, foolishly, to interpret as unrelated business stress. The rain started on a Tuesday and hadn't stopped by Thursday, the kind of relentless New England downpour that turned the Charles River gray and the whole campus into a smear of black umbrellas. I was 3 hours into helping Sophie's team weld a new roll cage when Marcus texted me. "Dude, Grant's been standing outside the engineering building for like an hour, in the rain, not moving. It's kind of freaking me out." I found him exactly where Marcus said, soaked through his dress shirt, dark hair plastered flat, staring at the garage's lit windows like a man watching a life he wasn't allowed to have. "Grant, what are you doing?" "Nothing," he said too fast, water running in rivulets down his jaw. "I was walking. I stopped." "You've been standing in a monsoon for an hour to stop." He didn't answer, which was, from Grant Ashford, basically a confession. I grabbed his sleeve, soaked through, cold as the rain itself, and hauled him inside before he could argue, and by the time we got back to his suite, his teeth were audibly chattering, and his skin had gone the pale, waxy color of someone running a genuine fever. "You absolute idiot," I said, no heat in it, guiding him down onto the couch, stripping off his ruined shirt while he made weak, half-hearted attempts to protest. "Why didn't you just come inside?" "Because," Grant said, voice rough, eyes glassy with fever, "you were in there, with her, laughing, and I didn't I didn't know what I was supposed to do with that. I froze, one hand still on his shoulder, water soaking through my own sleeve. With Sophie? Grant, I was just helping her with the car. I know that, he said, miserable and burning up and completely without his usual armor. I know that, logically. But I stood outside for an hour anyway, because some idiot, ancient part of my brain decided it needed to watch you exist in a room I wasn't in. The confession landed somewhere in my chest like a dropped wrench, sharp and unmistakable. For a full 5 seconds, I forgot how to form English words. Then I did what any reasonable person does when confronted with an emotionally compromised, feverish billionaire heir. I panicked into caretaking mode, because it was easier than examining why my own pulse had gone completely haywire. I filled a basin with cool water. I found a shirt in his drawer that wasn't damp and wrestled him into it with the tenderness of someone handling a large, uncooperative cat. I sat with him for the next 4 hours, wiping the fever sweat from his neck and collarbone, listening to him mutter half-lucid things about boardrooms and expectations and a childhood spent mostly alone in enormous empty houses while his parents chased quarterly earnings on 3 different continents. Somewhere around hour 2, it occurred to me that I hadn't checked my phone once, hadn't thought about the cross-portfolio or my own carefully laid self-preservation plan or anything at all except the rise and fall of his breathing, and that this, too, was new, caring about something enough to forget to be lazy about it. Nobody ever just stayed, he mumbled at one point, eyes half closed, fingers loosely curling around my wrist like he needed something solid to hold. You keep staying. Someone has to, I said, throat unexpectedly tight. Might as well be me. By midnight his fever broke, sweat cooling on his skin, breathing evening out into something deep and steady. I sat there in the dim lamplight, watching the sharp, guarded lines of his face go soft in sleep, and understood, with the horrible clarity of a man watching a very expensive plan collapse in real time, that I had failed spectacularly at Phase 2. I was not going to match-make Grant Ashford with anyone. I was, against every ounce of self-preserving common sense I possessed, already completely in love with him. He woke around 2 in the morning, disoriented, reaching instinctively for me before his eyes had even fully focused, and went crimson with mortification the second he registered where and how. He'd fallen asleep, half collapsed against my shoulder with a damp washcloth still resting on his forehead. I need you to forget everything I said tonight, Grant announced, with the wrecked dignity of a man attempting to negotiate a merger from a position of total defeat. Absolutely not. I'm framing it. Some idiot ancient part of my brain is getting engraved on a plaque, Julian. I'm considering cross-stitching it onto a pillow. I will fire you from whatever imaginary position you think you hold in my life, Grant muttered, but he was fighting a smile even as he said it, and when I laughed, actually laughed, the sound easy and unguarded, something in his face softened in a way I felt land directly in my chest. Get some sleep, Ashford, I said, standing to leave, already dreading the walk back to my own suite in the still pouring rain. We'll pretend this never happened. Right after I make you promise never to stand outside in a monsoon again. His hand closed around my wrist before I made it 2 steps unexpectedly gentle. Stay, he said quiet, none of the earlier bravado left in it. Just stay. I sleep better when someone's actually in the room. I stayed. I told myself it didn't mean anything. I fell asleep on top of the covers in his oversized t-shirt, exactly 1 foot of careful, deliberate distance between us, and woke up at dawn with his arms slung loosely over my waist, and his face pressed into my hair, and I did not move for a very long time, terrified that if I did, I'd wake up back under that truck and discover this had all been some elaborate, cruel dream. It wasn't. It was, as far as I could tell, the first genuinely good morning either of us had had in years. Some feelings, I was learning, don't care about your 5-year plan. Neither of us said the word boyfriend out loud for another 2 weeks, which meant we spent that entire stretch of time doing something that was, by any honest measurement, dating, while insisting to anyone who asked that it absolutely was not. We're just close, I told Marcus, for the 3rd time that week, while ironing a shirt for dinner with a man I was, allegedly, not dating. You're ironing a shirt for him, Marcus said, not looking up from his controller. You've never ironed anything in your life. I've seen you microwave a wrinkle out of a jacket. This is a special occasion. You said it wasn't a date. It's a special non-date occasion. The special non-date occasion was, ostensibly, a work dinner, Grant needed a +1 for a smaller, more relaxed gathering of Ashford Group junior partners, and I had been, in his exact words, the only person tolerable enough to invite. I arrived in the ironed shirt, feeling unreasonably nervous for a man who had, only days earlier, wiped fever sweet off this exact same person's collarbone, and found Grant waiting by the restaurant entrance, looking like he'd stepped directly out of the pages of the novel I used to read under my blanket. Dark suit, hair combed back, that same devastating, understated confidence. "You look like you're overthinking something," Grant observed, offering his arm with a small, private smile that felt like it belonged to me alone. "I'm always overthinking something. Currently, it's whether ordering the cheapest entree on the menu makes me look humble or suspicious. Order whatever you want. I own part of the restaurant." "Of course you do." The restaurant itself was the kind of place that didn't bother printing prices. All low lighting and candlelit tablecloths and a maitre d' who greeted Grant by first name, and I spent the first 10 minutes doing the thing I always did in rooms like that, cataloging every exit, every unspoken rule, every fork whose purpose I was quietly guessing at, until Grant, without looking up from the menu, murmured outside in under his breath, and I realized he'd noticed me staring at the silverware and was simply, casually, saving me the trouble of asking. Dinner went smoothly right up until dessert, when one of the junior partners, a sharp-eyed woman named Priya, who clearly missed nothing, leaned across the table and asked, with entirely too much delight, "So how long have you two been together, exactly?" Grant choked, mid-sip, on an extremely expensive glass of wine. I dropped my fork directly into a plate of creme brulee, with a clatter loud enough to turn heads 2 tables over. "We're not," Grant started. "Colleagues," I said at the same moment. "Rivals, historically. It's complicated." Priya looked between us with the particular, knowing amusement of someone watching two people fail spectacularly to lie. "Right," she said. "Colleagues who share a dessert fork and haven't stopped touching hands since the appetizer course." We both looked down at our hands, mine resting on the white tablecloth, his covering it entirely, fingers laced together in a gesture apparently neither of us had consciously decided to make. Grant went slightly red. I went slightly redder. "We're figuring it out," Grant admitted finally, voice quiet, eyes fixed on me rather than the table, "at our own pace." "Take your time," Priya said, entirely too pleased with herself, signaling for the check. "Though for what it's worth, Mr. Ashford, that's the first time in 3 years I've seen you smile at a business dinner without it looking like it physically hurt." Neither of us corrected her again. Word travels fast at a school where half the parents own newspapers. The photo hit the campus forum on a Monday morning. Me, elbow deep in Sophie's engine bay, leaning across her to reach a wrench, grease on both our faces, both of us laughing at some joke I don't even remember, captured from an angle outside the garage's chain-link fence that made it look, to anyone who wanted it to, like something far more intimate than transmission repair. The caption read, "Julian Cross and the Scholarship Girl? Guess the Ashford rivalry has a new plot twist." I found out about it, because Marcus burst into our room, holding his phone like it was on fire. I found out Grant had seen it because he stopped answering my texts entirely, and when I knocked on his door that evening, he opened it wearing an expression I hadn't seen since our very first coffee-stained encounter, that same cold, closed-off wall, rebuilt brick by brick in less than 12 hours. "Grant, that photo is completely." "It's fine," he said, in a voice that made it extremely clear it was not fine. "You don't owe me an explanation, Cross. We never established what we were." "We haven't established it because you keep standing in the rain instead of saying things," I snapped, more sharply than I meant to, frustration and hurt tangling together in my chest. "That photo is nothing. Sophie was showing me how to reset a torque converter." "That's it. That's the whole scandal. You spend more time in that garage than you do anywhere else," Grant said, arms crossed, jaw tight. "You laugh with her the way you never laugh at these mixers with me." Maybe I misread the entire situation. It wouldn't be the first time I misjudged what you actually wanted from me. The door started to close. I put my hand flat against it, harder than necessary. "You want to know what I actually want?" I said, heart pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. "I want you to stop being an idiot for 1 whole minute and let me finish a sentence. That's what I want. Also, and I genuinely cannot believe I'm the one saying this to you, maybe consider that a man who's this dramatic about a garage photo might just be a little bit in love." That at least got a flicker of something that wasn't pure ice. He didn't open the door further, but he didn't shut it either. For 2 days after that, we orbited each other in the particular miserable way people do when they're too proud and too scared to make the first real move. I saw him across the quad and he looked away first. I sat 2 rows behind him in the one lecture we shared and spent the entire hour composing and deleting the same text message. Can we talk? Marcus, ever the diplomat, described the situation as watching 2 golden retrievers refuse to fetch the same stick out of spite, which was infuriatingly accurate. I nearly caved on the second night, standing outside his door with my hand raised to knock, before losing my nerve entirely and going home to eat cereal directly out of the box like the emotionally stunted man I apparently still was, rich body or not. It was Sophie, of all people, who fixed it, barging into Grant's suite 2 days later without knocking, dragging her laptop like a woman with evidence to present in court. Okay, first of all, she announced, shoving the screen at Grant before either of us could stop her. Here's the security footage from the garage, time-stamped, showing Julian and me elbow-deep in a transmission, not each other. Second of all, she rounded on me, hands on hips, grease-stained coveralls and all. You have been trying to set me up with this idiot for a month, and I need you both to know that I would honestly rather date my own torque wrench. No offense, Grant. You're objectively attractive, but you have the emotional range of a parking meter. Grant blinked. That's fair. Third, Sophie said, turning to me, voice softening just slightly. Julian, sweetheart, everyone on this campus has known you're in love with him since the coffee incident. You handed a billionaire $200 in cash and called it a sweeter fund. Nobody does that for a rival. I opened my mouth to argue. Nothing came out. She wasn't wrong. Sophie snatched her laptop back, looking supremely satisfied with herself, and headed for the door. I have a race car to finish building. You two have, whatever this is, figure it out before I have to referee again. I don't get paid enough for this, and I don't even get paid at all. The door clicked shut behind her, and suddenly it was just the 2 of us, standing in the too quiet aftermath, security footage still glowing faintly on the abandoned laptop screen across the room. I'm not in love with Sophie, I said, before either of us could find a reason to stay silent again. I was never in love with Sophie. I was trying to matchmake her with you, because I read a book once about a villain who fell for the male lead and got his entire fortune stripped for it, and I panicked, and I decided the safest thing to do was hand you off to someone else before I could ruin everything by actually feeling something. Grant stared at me. You read a book about Julian. What are you talking about? It doesn't matter. It genuinely, gloriously didn't. Not anymore. What matters is that I spent a month trying to set you up with my mechanic friend because I was too much of a coward to admit that the person I actually wanted standing in my garage, covered in grease, laughing at my terrible jokes, was you. It's always been you. Probably since the sweater. Definitely since the stairwell. Something in Grant's face cracked open completely. Every carefully maintained wall, every icy, unreadable expression, gone in an instant, replaced by something so raw and unguarded it nearly knocked the breath out of me. Up close, all the sharp, brittle edges he usually carried into every room had simply gone quiet, the kind of stillness that only came out around people he trusted completely, which was up until 3 months ago absolutely nobody. You beautiful, insufferable disaster, he said, closing the distance between us in 2 long strides, hands coming up to frame my face like he needed to be sure I was real. I have been trying to figure out how to tell you I'm in love with you for 3 weeks. I bought you $200 worth of the exact coffee you spilled on me, just to have an excuse to see you every morning. I stood in the rain like an absolute fool, because I couldn't handle watching you exist in a room without me in it. I have run corporate negotiations against grown men twice my age without breaking a sweat, and you have reduced me to standing outside in a thunderstorm like a golden retriever. That tracks, I said, laughing breathless, my eyes stinging in a way I refused to acknowledge. I used to call myself your golden retriever plan, actually. Ironic. Julian. Grant, can I kiss you now, or do you have another matchmaking scheme to run first? Schemes officially retired, I said, and closed the last of the distance myself. The kiss was nothing like the novel described. No dramatic thunderclap, no swelling orchestral score, just warm and real and slightly clumsy at first, both of us adjusting, both of us smiling too hard against each other's mouths to get it perfectly right. His hands were careful in my hair. Mine fisted in the front of his shirt like I was afraid he'd disappear if I let go. When we finally broke apart, foreheads still pressed together, both of us breathing hard, he wore an expression of such open, undone happiness that I felt it land somewhere permanent in my chest. "For the record," Grant murmured, thumb brushing along my cheekbone, "I never once believed you were trying to sabotage anything. I just couldn't figure out why the campus's biggest rival kept bringing me soup. Wasn't soup. That was, technically, a bribe." I grinned. "You were supposed to fall for me eventually. I just didn't plan on falling first." Word of our very public, very undeniable relationship reached the whole campus within about 6 hours, mostly because Grant Ashford walked me to my Thursday lecture holding my hand in front of half the economics department, which apparently constituted breaking news. It also, inconveniently, reached Bradley Whitfield. Bradley was the kind of legacy student whose family name got him into rooms his personality never could have earned alone. Third cousin to the Whitfields who'd been at that mixer, and someone who had, for reasons I never fully understood, appointed himself Grant's rival-in-waiting. The second word got out that Julian Cross wasn't playing villain anymore. Bradley had never actually spoken to me before that spring, as far as I could tell, but he seemed to have decided somewhere around sophomore year that being aggressively unpleasant to a Cross was the fastest available shortcut to relevance on a campus where his own family's fortune had quietly stopped growing a generation ago. He had spent most of the semester orbiting our story like a mosquito nobody had bothered to swat, showing up at mixers to loudly remind anyone in earshot that the Cross family has always been a little unstable, making pointed comments about old money mixing with new scandal whenever Grant and I walked past. I'd mostly ignored him, on the theory that engaging with Bradley Whitfield required a level of energy better spent on literally anything else. A theory I stand by, incidentally, as one of the more successful applications of my personal philosophy of doing the least amount of work necessary to get people to leave me alone. That theory held right up until he decided ignoring him wasn't an option he was willing to accept. His plan, delivered with the confidence of a man who had clearly never once considered a backup, was to expose an old rumor, dredged up from somewhere in the original Julian Cross's petty forgotten past, claiming I'd once tried to hack into the university's financial aid database to sabotage Sophie's scholarship. He printed flyers, actual physical flyers, taped up around the quad like it was still 2003, featuring a blurry photo of me and a headline that read "The Truth About Julian Cross." There were two problems with Bradley's plan. The first problem was that Sophie Bennett found the flyer taped to the engineering building before I did, and Sophie Bennett did not appreciate anyone dragging her scholarship into someone else's petty grudge match. The second problem was that Bradley had, in his enthusiasm, printed the flyers using the campus print shop's account, an account, as it turned out, linked directly to the Whitfield family's own line of business credit, the exact records Grant's team audited every quarter as part of an ongoing supplier relationship between the two families. By Friday afternoon, an anonymous printout was circulating the business school, detailing exactly which corporate card had funded 400 defamatory flyers, alongside a formal, extremely polite letter from Ashford Group's legal department reminding the Whitfield family that libel wasn't covered under their current supplier discount. Sophie's contribution was less legal and considerably more satisfying. She rigged the sprinkler system outside the exact bulletin board where Bradley liked to hold court with his friends, timed to go off the moment he strutted past to admire his own flyers one more time. He got hit with a solid 90 seconds of ice-cold irrigation water in front of a courtyard full of witnesses, ruining a jacket that, according to campus gossip, cost more than my old truck. "That's for the flyers," Sophie called out cheerfully from the safety of a nearby bench, not even looking up from her laptop. "And also for the time you called my scholarship charity at the winter gala." "I have a long memory, Bradley." Bradley squelched away in humiliated silence, dripping a trail across the courtyard while a dozen phones documented every step, and by Monday, nobody on campus remembered his name for anything except the sprinkler guy, a legacy considerably less impressive than the one his family tree had promised him. He transferred his flyer removal complaint to the Student Conduct Board, which took one look at the time-stamped print job linked to his own family's account, and quietly suggested he might want to withdraw it before it became a matter of public record. He withdrew it within the hour. Grant, to his credit, offered, quietly, and only once, to have the Ashford legal team pursue Bradley for the original defamation, flyers and all, and I turned him down, mostly on the grounds that filing paperwork would sound like an enormous amount of effort for a man who'd already been publicly hosed down by a sprinkler system in front of half the student body. Some victories, I'd decided, were simply more satisfying left alone to finish humiliating themselves without professional assistance. The strangest part, in the end, was that Bradley himself seemed to take the lesson better than anyone expected. I ran into him weeks later outside the library, soaked reputation fully dried out but clearly still smarting, and braced for another round of hostility. Instead, he just gave me a tight, grudging nod. "Sprinklers were a nice touch," he admitted. "Didn't see that coming." "Wasn't my idea," I said. "Sophie has a long memory and an engineering degree." Never make an enemy of someone who can rig irrigation systems. "Noted," Bradley said, and for what it was worth, he actually left us alone after that. "You know," Grant said, watching the whole spectacle from the garage doorway, arms slung comfortably around my shoulders. "I could have handled that more discreetly." "Discreet is boring," Sophie said, still typing. "Also, I billed the flyer removal to his account too. Small victories." I laughed until my ribs hurt, leaning into Grant's side, and thought, not for the first time, that whatever cosmic accident had shoved my soul into this ridiculous, gorgeous second lead body, I would take it, every single unpredictable second of it, over my old life 1,000 times out of 1,000. If Bradley's flyer campaign was the appetizer of that spring, the Cross-Ashford family dinner was the main course nobody actually wanted to eat. It had been on the calendar for months, an annual, deeply awkward tradition where the two rival families gathered under the thin pretense of maintaining civil business relations, which really meant 2 hours of my father, Walter Cross, making pointed comments about the Ashford real estate portfolio while pretending not to notice his own son had shown up holding hands with the heir to it. "Not a chance," I told Grant the morning of, staring at my closet like it might contain an escape hatch. "I love you, but I am not doing that dinner. I have raised faking a stomach bug to an art form. I once got out of an entire semester of mandatory fitness testing this way. I will do it again, right now, for you, out of pure loyalty to my own comfort." "You survived a hydraulic lift," Grant said dryly. Straightening his tie in my mirror like this was an entirely reasonable thing to say out loud, which, at this point in our relationship, it kind of was. "You can survive my mother asking invasive questions about your intentions. That's different." The hydraulic lift didn't ask about my intentions. He did not let me fake a stomach bug. He showed up at my door at 6 sharp, looking unfairly composed for a man walking directly into a family minefield, and steered me toward the car with the same calm, immovable patience he used to walk into boardrooms full of people twice his age. Dinner started badly and got worse. My father, who, in this life, was a sharp, calculating real estate mogul rather than a man drowning in gambling debt, but who I was learning shared at least one core trait with his old life counterpart, namely an inability to read a room, spent the soup course loudly reminiscing about the good old days when Cross and Ashford were real competitors, in a tone that made it very clear he considered our relationship a personal business failure. "I raised you to beat him," my father said to me directly, gesturing at Grant with his wine glass, "not to fall in love with him." The table went silent. Grant's hand found mine under the tablecloth, steady, grounding. "With respect, sir," I said, and I felt something in me settle into place as I said it. Not the frantic, self-preserving Julian who'd woken up in this body determined only to keep his fortune, but someone steadier, someone who'd figured out, over one strange semester, exactly what he actually wanted to protect. "You raised me to survive. I'm the one who decided what surviving well actually looks like. And it looks like this. It looks like him." My father opened his mouth, closed it, and, in the single most surprising development of the entire evening, actually laughed, short and disbelieving, shaking his head like a man conceding a chess match he hadn't realized he'd already lost. "You've got more spine than you did last year," he admitted grudgingly, which was, from Walter Cross, roughly the equivalent of a Hallmark card. "Fine, Ashford. Take care of my son, or I will bury your company in permits, so slowly it'll take a decade to pour a single foundation." "Understood, sir," Grant said, entirely straight-faced, and squeezed my hand once under the table, a small, private we survived it, that made the whole excruciating dinner worth sitting through. Even the part, 20 minutes later, where my father cornered me by the coat check to inform me, with visible reluctance, that Grant wasn't the worst thing that could have happened to this family, which I intended to have printed on a mug the very next day. Grant's mother, for her part, spent most of the meal studying me with the sharp, assessing look of a woman who'd clearly read every gossip column about the Cross-Ashford scandal and drawn her own conclusions. It wasn't until dessert that she finally spoke directly to me. "My son," she said, "has not smiled unprompted in a business setting in 3 years. Tonight he has done it 4 times, and every single time it was because you said something ridiculous." She studied me a moment longer, something unreadable in her expression. "I don't know what to make of that, Mr. Cross, except that I suppose I should thank you for it." "You can call me Julian," I said. "Mr. Cross makes me feel like I'm about to get audited." She actually laughed, a real surprise sound, quickly smoothed back into composure, and I decided, right then, that whatever else happened, I could survive future family dinners as long as Grant kept holding my hand under the table the way he was holding it now. Spring found its way onto campus the way it always eventually does, first in stubborn crocuses along the quad, then in the sudden, collective decision of every student to eat lunch outdoors, regardless of temperature. Grant and I had settled into something that felt less like the frantic, plot-driven romance of my old favorite novel, and more like something sturdier, quieter, entirely our own, the kind of relationship built less out of grand gestures and more out of 1,000 small, unglamorous Tuesdays, which, it turned out, suited a formerly exhausted mechanic and a formerly friendless heir better than any string quartet ever could. He still ran board meetings with the same unbothered precision that had made him a campus legend. But now he texted me updates from underneath the table during the boring parts, ridiculous commentary on which executive had fallen asleep, and I texted back mechanic memes he pretended not to find funny, usually from the couch, usually while making absolutely no effort to move for the rest of the afternoon. My 2 great loves, as it turned out, were Grant Ashford and doing nothing at all, and I refused to feel bad about either one. I still spent most of my free afternoons in Sophie's garage. She'd made peace, eventually, with the fact that Grant now showed up too, usually bearing coffee for both of us, usually staying to watch rather than glower, occasionally even rolling up his $400 sleeves to hand me tools when I asked, learning the names of things one grease-stained lesson at a time. "You're better at this than I expected," I told him one evening, watching him carefully, almost reverently, hand me a ratchet like it was a piece of family china. "I'm good at most things," Grant said, with the particular arrogance that I'd come to find, infuriatingly, charming rather than annoying. "Cars just happen to be new, humble." "I contain multitudes," he said, throwing my own line back at me with a smirk sharp enough to make my pulse skip, and I decided, right then, elbow deep in a stranger's carburetor with grease on both our faces, that this exact unglamorous, ordinary, ridiculous moment was worth more than every zero in the cross-family bank account combined. There was, admittedly, one more surprise waiting before the semester ended, and it came from the last place I expected. Marcus. I found out by accident, walking into the garage one Tuesday to grab a socket set I'd left behind, and discovering Marcus sitting on Sophie's workbench several days into an entirely unauthorized project of helping fix her spare alternator, badly, while she pretended not to notice he was making everything worse out of pure, transparent excuse to linger energy. "Since when do you two hang out?" I asked, deeply suspicious. "Since he showed up with terrible pickup lines about torque and refused to leave," Sophie said, not looking up, though the corner of her mouth was fighting a smile she clearly didn't want me to see. "They were good pickup lines," Marcus said, wounded. "Are you a socket wrench? Because you've got me tightened up is a classic." "It is not," Sophie and I said, in perfect, horrified unison. I didn't say anything else about it at the time, mostly because I'd learned my lesson thoroughly enough about interfering in other people's love lives. But I noticed, over the following weeks, that Marcus started showing up at the garage without any excuse at all, and that Sophie stopped pretending she minded. Sophie left for her research fellowship in London that June, dragging a set of designer luggage tags across a campus quad full of people who'd miss her more than they'd admit. I found her by the old stone fountain the day before her flight, surrounded by suitcases, looking equal parts terrified and thrilled. I never actually apologized, I told her, for trying to set you up with my boyfriend for an entire month. Sophie laughed, standing to hug me, smelling faintly of engine grease and airport-bound nerves. Julian, you did me a favor. I get to spend the next 2 years doing research I've wanted since I was 12, instead of navigating some doomed rivalry-turned-romance plot. Honestly, thank you for being the world's worst wingman. It forced me to figure out what I actually wanted. Which is an engineering fellowship and 0 billionaires, she said, grinning, hoisting her carry-on over one shoulder like it weighed nothing at all, the way she'd once made a 200-pound transmission look easy. Though if he ever hurts you, my number doesn't change internationally, and I know several ways to sabotage a car so the brakes fail very slowly. Noted, Grant said dryly, appearing behind me with 2 coffees, having clearly heard every word. Before she disappeared through security, she paused, turned, and pointed directly at Marcus, who had shown up at the last possible minute, slightly out of breath, holding a coffee he'd clearly bought as an excuse to be there. 2 years, Sophie told him. I'll be back in 2 years. Don't do anything stupid before then. No promises, Marcus said, grinning, and Sophie just shook her head, laughing, before disappearing through the gate, off toward the exact future she'd built for herself, no rewritten plot required. I watched her go, then turned to find Grant already watching me instead, coffee forgotten in his hand, that same open, unguarded look on his face that I'd been slowly, happily getting used to. What? I asked. Nothing, he said, just thinking that I used to hate you, and I genuinely don't remember why anymore, and now I can't remember what my life looked like before you spilled coffee on me. Romantic, I said, very smooth, 10 out of 10. I contain multitudes, he said again, and kissed me right there by the fountain, in broad daylight, in front of God and the entire Fairview quad, and for the first time since a hydraulic lift ended one life and started another, I felt, completely and without reservation, like I'd finally landed exactly where I was supposed to be. Married life, it turns out, is mostly just the same relationship you already had, except now someone occasionally calls you my husband in front of his terrifying board of directors and watches you turn the color of a fire truck. We bought a place outside the city, nothing like the Ashford penthouse, much to Grant's family's ongoing bewilderment, but a converted farmhouse with an honest-to-God detached garage, because apparently marrying a real estate heir does not cure a man of wanting somewhere quiet to rebuild carburetors on the weekend, and does absolutely nothing to cure that same man of wanting to spend every other weekend doing precisely nothing on the porch instead. You could hire someone to do that, Grant pointed out for approximately the 400th time, leaning in the garage doorway on a Saturday morning, sleeves already rolled up in the universal gesture of a man who fully intended to help, and definitely was not going to help. You could stop hovering and hand me the 9/16, I said, not looking up from the engine bay of the vintage Mustang we'd been restoring together for the better part of a year. His idea, actually, some attempt to have a hobby that wasn't quarterly earnings reports. He handed me the wrong wrench. He always handed me the wrong wrench. 5 years of marriage and the man could restructure a multinational merger blindfolded but still couldn't reliably identify a socket size, which I'd long since decided was the single most endearing thing about him. Wrong one, I said, holding out my hand. I was testing you. You were not testing me, you were guessing, and you guessed wrong, exactly like you always do. A man does not guess, Grant said, with the wounded dignity of a man who absolutely did guess, settling onto the workbench beside me anyway, close enough that his knee pressed warm against mine. A man strategically explores available options. Sure, honey. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, the radio playing something classic and staticky, sunlight slanting gold through the open garage door, and I thought, the way I still did, sometimes with a kind of quiet disbelief, about the version of me who died, broke and exhausted under a stranger's truck, who never once imagined a life this soft was possible. That version of me would not have believed a single second of this. The farmhouse, the ring, the ridiculous man currently guessing wrench sizes beside him. And some mornings I still woke up half expecting the whole thing to dissolve, the way good dreams tend to, right before I remembered it was simply, ordinarily, permanently mine. By the way, Grant said eventually, in the deliberately casual tone he used exclusively for things that were not, in fact, casual, my mother called. She wants to know if we're hosting Thanksgiving this year, or if she needs to, and I quote, fly out there herself to make sure you two haven't burned the farmhouse down. We are extremely capable adults. You set the toaster on fire last week. That toaster had it coming, I said with dignity. It was making unreasonable demands. Tell that to my mother. I will, I said, right after I tell her that her son still can't tell a 9/16 from a ½ inch after 5 years of supervised practice, and yet somehow runs an entire real estate empire without breaking a sweat. Different skill sets, Grant said, entirely unbothered, pressing a kiss to my temple that undercut the argument completely, and I let him have the point, mostly because arguing further would have required getting up, and I was, if nothing else, still consistently unwilling to do that without a very good reason. Marcus is bringing the dog over later, he added, wiping grease off his hands with a rag he was holding, I noted, entirely backward. He says it needs, quote, auntie and uncle bonding time. We are not the dog's aunt and uncle. Marcus needs boundaries. Marcus has never had boundaries in his life. It's part of his charm. Speaking of charm, I said, setting down my wrench, turning to look at him properly. Grease-smudged, sun-warmed, effortlessly, ridiculously handsome even after 5 years. Even in an old t-shirt, in a garage that smelled like motor oil instead of a boardroom. Did I ever tell you that you're still, hands down, the worst investment decision I ever made? You've mentioned it, usually right before you kiss me. Consistency is important in a marriage, I said, and did exactly that, leaning in to kiss him slow and easy, tasting coffee and something warm underneath that I'd long ago stopped trying to name and just started calling home. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed. Marcus, early, already shouting something about the dog needing to meet its favorite uncles, and Grant groaned against my mouth, forehead dropping to my shoulder in mock despair, laughing despite himself. No peace, he muttered. Not one single moment of peace in this marriage. You married a mechanic who used to try to matchmake you with someone else, I reminded him, grinning, already heading for the door to let Marcus and, presumably, an extremely excitable golden retriever inside. Peace was never part of the deal, Ashford. Good thing I never wanted peace, Grant said, catching my hand before I could get too far, pulling me back for one more kiss. Unhurried and certain, right there in the grease-scented light of our ordinary, impossible, entirely ours life. Just wanted you. Thanks for sticking with Julian and Grant all the way to the very last wrench. If a self-preservation plan spiraling into the world's messiest, sweetest love story made you laugh out loud even once, follow the channel for more stories exactly like this one. New chapters drop regularly, and this definitely won't be the last disaster to happily ever after you'll get to watch unfold. See you in the next one.